Well, first, thanks so much for that great introduction. That was so nice. And thank you for inviting me to present here today. I'm really excited to talk about some of the research that I've been working on throughout my research career and also to be here with ISRA. And I've just really been enjoying getting involved with ISRA these past few years. So hopefully you can see everyone at the next conference in person. So today I'm going to be presenting on some studies that I've been doing on looking at youth bullying perpetration. So specifically looking at what are some contextual and individual factors that contribute to bullying perpetration specifically. So I'm going to start off by talking about some of the research that I've done on individual differences in bullying perpetration with a focus on primarily personality traits, and then talking about how these personality traits work alongside social and environmental factors, so that larger context that we might see with bullying perpetration, and then what this all could mean and some implications for bullying prevention. Um, Given the audience here, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with bullying research, but I thought it's still important to go over some of the context of bullying. So we know that bullying involves when someone has greater power, whether that's physical power or social power or psychological power, taking advantage of this power, and they're really abusing their power to harm someone who has less power. And as they're doing this, they're gaining some sort of benefit out of this. So there's a reason why they're doing it. And we know that bullying really is an issue for young people, with anywhere between 30 to 40% of young people being affected across the world, although the prevalence rates vary by region and type of measure that's been used. But we see this overall pattern that prevalence rates peak during adolescence. So something happening in this developmental period where we see higher levels of bullying prevalence rates. And some of the reasons why we might see bullying being higher among adolescent age periods might be some of the social relationship or social benefits that have been associated with bullying in previous research. So lots of great studies out there that really see this consistent pattern of bullying perpetration. And this would be like pure bullying perpetration, not that overlap of people who are also victimized. But bullying perpetration being associated with status benefits like popularity, social dominance, and also being associated with access to dating and romantic relationships, which we know is another thing that becomes important during that adolescent age period. And kind of overall, we see that bullying perpetration, or those who are engaging in bullying perpetration, have a lot of peer valued characteristics. So they're seen among their peers as being high on attractiveness, having leadership qualities, having self-efficacy. So the challenge really is to think about, well, if there are these social benefits being associated with bullying behavior, so if people are kind of abusing their power and they're able to get these types of resources, then how are we going to ask young people to stop doing something that's benefiting them? So kind of the viewpoint that I have is, if we can try to understand some of the individual and social or environmental contextual factors that also contribute to bullying, then maybe we can try to mitigate them and reduce them, and really reduce the opportunities for young people to first engage in bullying, and then also for them to have these types of benefits that are associated with bullying. So that's where my research has really focused on the individual, social, and environmental factors that contribute to bullying, recognizing that it is a complex issue and there are so many different factors that can contribute to bullying perpetration. So the overarching framework that I'm really interested in looking at is Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. So this is obviously a very common model that you've probably seen in other contexts as well. But the idea is that someone who is developing at the center, so the child or youth, we see their individual characteristics at the center, but then they are also surrounded by a series of nested ecological systems. So at the most immediate setting, it would be that environment that they spend most of their time in, like at home or with their peers or at school. And then these systems start to get a little bit more further away from that individual, but they could still have direct or indirect associations with that developing individual. So like at that macro system level, what are some of the social and cultural contexts at that time, the norms, what's valued or tolerated in that society? And then at the broadest level, the chronosystem, including changes over time, I think as a society, but also within an individual's own lifespan as well. So I think this model's great because it captures that complexity of what is associated with bullying, but also that's kind of one of the challenges too, because it's hard to capture all of these systems and all the factors within these systems in a single study. And there's some really great studies out there that capture bullying from the social ecological framework. I just wanted to highlight one of the narrative reviews that came out in 2012, which I think is a really popular and highly cited review that I also look back to all the time. But really, they just nicely covered a lot of the literature at that time for all of the factors across these systems. So these are just some examples of factors that have been examined with bullying, ranging from individual characteristics to like cultural beliefs or opportunity structures or changes within someone's family. So lots of great studies that have covered this already. But I think it's also interesting to note that some of these factors, they can have direct or independent contributions or associations with bullying, but it can also get more complicated. So we know there's going to be moderating factors and mediating factors. And again, really a great number of studies out there that have captured some of these factors, like how does empathy or social status moderate one another in the contribution to bullying, or contextual factors at school or with peers, mediating factors with social and emotional skills. And then it can get even more complex by looking at whether we're looking at these associations between individuals, individual youth, but also what's happening within individuals in their lifespan as they develop across time. So I just wanted to kind of briefly situate the research that I've been doing in the larger context of research that's already been ongoing on bullying from this social ecological perspective. So first, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the research that I've done with individual differences and bullying, with a focus more so on personality. And this kind of comes from that idea that we know, well, not everyone uses bullying behavior, and maybe there are certain traits or characteristics that are associated with bullying. So perhaps people who are higher on these characteristics might be more likely to use bullying than, let's say, someone who is lower on these traits. From this perspective, some researchers say that maybe bullying is part of a behavioral expression of individual differences in personality or temperament or some sort of trait. And I thought this is also interesting too, because generally we talk a lot about how personality or temperament traits are stable, and most of the meta-analyses do indicate that there's high evidence for rank order stability. So like if someone is more outgoing than I am today, they'll probably continue to be more outgoing than I am like 10 years from now. But at the same time, there's some evidence in meta-analyses for mean level changes in personality, meaning that at certain points of development, we see some changes in these levels of personality traits. And in particular, there's some evidence for this idea of the disruption hypothesis, which is the idea that traits reflecting maturity, like self-regulation, conscientiousness, emotional stability, they have a temporary dip or decline during adolescence. And I thought that's really interesting because that's also the time period where we see that bullying peaks in prevalence rates. So I was really curious to see how these developmental trends of personality, in particular, maybe antisocial personality traits, relate to bullying across adolescent development. And can we find some unique developmental trajectories? Oops. There Yep. Again, really a number of great studies that have looked at a variety of traits related to bullying perpetration. And for the most part, they show this idea of being higher on antisocial tendencies, like being more callous and unemotional, having difficulty regulating behavior or emotion, lacking empathy, being higher in the dark triad, being more exploitative and less agreeable are on average associated with bullying perpetration. And so for the most part, many of these studies have taken this variable centered approach, meaning that on average, they see individuals who are higher on bullying are also on average higher on antisocial personality traits. But what I was really curious to learn more about is like, are there going to be unique developmental patterns? So not all young people are developing in the same way. So can we find subgroups of youth who might be higher on antisocial personality traits, but maybe they're not using as much bullying? And if we can try to identify these different groups, then maybe we can also look to see like, what are the differences and what are the risk factors for those who are using bullying behavior? So this takes on more of a person-centered approach where maybe for the most part, those who use bullying are also higher on antisocial personality traits, but maybe there are those who are lower on bullying and higher on these traits, or the reverse, they're higher on bullying, lower on these traits, and trying to get a better understanding of what these combinations look like and what these patterns look like across adolescence and across development. So I wanted to present two studies that I worked with Tracy on based on the MAC-teen study. And that's exactly what we tried to look at. We were looking at whether there were unique developmental trajectories of bullying perpetration. And then we looked at two additional personality traits. So one was narcissistic personality traits. So that idea of people who may feel that they are like superior to others or high on entitlement, this sense of entitlement. And then we also looked at trajectories of hypercompetitiveness in another study. And hypercompetitiveness captures that idea of kind of competing to win at all costs. So no matter the repercussions or who they might be harming, that they're competing to win. So this idea that maybe people who are higher on bullying do have this sense of entitlement. Maybe they're also very competitive. So we looked at these trajectories separately, and then we wanted to see how they came together. So I'll break down how we looked at these trajectories. So the data were from the McMaster teen study, and there were about 600 participants in both of these studies that were followed from grade 7 to grade 12. So in Canada, that would translate to ages 13 to 18, and they were followed annually. So first for bullying, the good news was that the majority, 82%, were low and decreasing on bullying from grade 7 to grade 12, so ages 13 to 18. But we found a smaller group of about 18% who were high and stable on bullying across this grade period from grade 7 to grade 12. So for some people, they are continuously high, and then for others, they are low and decreasing. So I think this highlights the unique trajectories that young people follow. Not everyone is following this same pattern, which would have been missed if we looked at everything on average. For narcissism, we found 3 trajectory groups. Most were moderate and stable, about just over half. There was a smaller group that were low and decreasing, and the group that we were really interested in was the almost 23% of individuals who were high and increasing on narcissism from grade 7 to grade 12. So I think this kind of supports that disruption hypothesis of how we actually can see for some people, there are these changes in personality that they are increasing on these traits. So we also did this with hypercompetitiveness, which we again found 3 groups. They were kind of similar to narcissism in the sense that most were moderate and stable. There was a low stable group, but again, we found a group that were high and increasing. So after finding these trajectory groups, we then put them together. So we were trying to see, well, how many people were high on bullying and also increasing on hypercompetitiveness, or high on bullying and also increasing on narcissism, and trying to see, did they have unique risk factors that differed from their peers who were lower on these traits or lower on bullying. And what we found was in both studies, the high risk group characterized by high bullying and either narcissism or competitiveness, they made a small percentage of the sample, so 6 to 9%, but they also had some unique additional characteristics. So in the narcissism study, we found additional individual differences. So this group was, compared to their peers, higher on hyperactivity and lower on empathy. So suggesting maybe they have some difficulties with self-regulation, but also having care or concern for others. We also found this group was predicted by lower anxiety, which we thought was interesting because typically we think like it's a good thing to have lower anxiety. We don't want people to have a higher anxiety. But in this case, we thought that maybe this reflects the idea that people who are using bullying and higher on narcissism are really not worried or concerned about much. Like maybe they're low on fear. They are not as concerned about the repercussions of their actions and maybe retaliation from their peers, for example. And in the competitiveness study, we actually found a group that were high on hypercompetitiveness but low on bullying. And when we compared these two groups, two of the distinguishing features were that the bullying group reported lower school climate and lower family functioning. And I thought that was really interesting because just as much as it's important to look at who is using bullying behavior, so whether they're higher on hypercompetitiveness or narcissism, that environmental context, that social and environmental context is also important. So if we know that they are feeling that their school or family has lower quality climate, then maybe that is a potential source for anti-bullying efforts that we can focus on. So I think this shows that it is important to consider in individual contexts just as much as we look at social and environmental contexts. So this kind of goes to my transitions to my second area that I wanted to present on how individual, social, and environmental factors might all kind of work together and how it's important to look at all of them moving forward to see how they work independently, but also interactively as well. So the next study I wanted to present was a study I did with Tony Volk, also here at Brock. And we looked at a sample of adolescents. So this was a cross-sectional sample of almost 400 adolescents, and they completed self-report measures on a variety of their individual and social environmental factors. So for for personality, we focused on honesty, humility. So this is a personality trait that is in the Hexaco personality model. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with the Hexaco, it's similar to the Big Five model, but there's this additional sixth trait called honesty, humility. So at the lower end, it captures people who are less honest and less humble. So they're more exploitative, they are more deceitful, they're more arrogant. So that was the personality trait we focused on in this study. And then we also asked youth to report about their experiences at home, with their school, the perceived level of school competition, and perceptions of violence in their neighborhood. So in this study, we were trying to see, can we capture a range of social and environmental factors using that Bronfenbrenner's model. So the summary of what we found was that each of these factors all had unique independent associations with bullying perpetration. So again, important to look at a range of factors. But in this study, we also tried to see if there were indirect effects through personality. And so I recognize this is a cross-sectional study, so it's obviously not a true mediation model, but the idea we were trying to test was that, can we see whether broader systems or broader factors might be related to more immediate factors like personality, and then in turn have indirect associations with bullying? And that is actually what we found, that indicators of more adverse social environments, so like poor parenting relationships, or poor or more competition at school, or perceiving higher levels of neighborhood violence, were all related to being more exploitative, which was in turn more associated with bullying perpetration. So it would be great in the future if we can then test this longitudinally in order to see whether there is this temporal direction of effects. But I think the takeaway here is that they both matter, or they all matter. In another study with some of Brock colleagues, we looked at honesty, humility again, but we looked at moderating factors of parenting. And in this study, what we found was that lower honesty, humility, so being exploitative, was associated with bullying perpetration, but only when parental knowledge was low or moderate. So in this study, we asked youth, how much do your parents actually know about what you do or who you hang out with? So when that knowledge was low, that's when we saw that this personality trait was related to bullying. But when parental knowledge was high and parents actually knew more about their child from the youth's perspective, this personality trait wasn't related to bullying. So I think that again kind of highlights that it's both. And if we know some of these contextual factors, then maybe that's a source for anti-bullying efforts. Like we can try to get a better understanding of what social factors we can target as buffers, for example. So that was just another example of how they might work together. So up until now, most of the research that I've presented, including my own research, has really focused on more of the immediate systems. So like personality traits, individual differences, things going on at home or at school. And this is kind of a general pattern that I've noticed, and also conversations with colleagues, that fewer studies really are looking at the macro system or chronosystem. So like what's going on in that larger social or cultural context and what's happening in society. And so we actually wanted to see if this pattern that we were seeing actually existed in the literature. So we recently did a systematic review that's currently under review. And in this systematic review, we specifically looked for studies from the last 10 years who said that they applied the social ecological model and to look at bullying. And we were curious to see what systems, what factors were primarily examined and what have been understudied as well. So overall, we found 72 studies met our inclusion criteria. And for those of us Canadian bullying researchers, only 4 of these were Canadian. Most were from the US or Europe. And kind of the big takeaway from this systematic review was that most of the studies, about 70%, primarily focused on microsystem factors, even though they have used the social ecological overarching framework. So I think this highlights that we do need more studies that kind of integrate across these factors and systems to get a more complete understanding. But at the same time, I can appreciate that one of the reasons might be like, it's a lot harder to define and measure these macro system factors compared to asking youth to share like their perceptions of their family or getting peer nominations, which are also still very challenging. But I think as a whole, it is a little bit harder to measure some of these broader macro factors. So in some of the research that I've been doing, one study that really stood out to me, and I suppose it's more of a collection of studies, but this study really stood out to me, that came out in 2009. So it's been around for a while, by Elgar and colleagues. And in this study, they looked at regional income inequality, specifically country level income inequality, in its associations with the prevalence of school bullying. And they actually found a positive association, meaning that higher income inequality was associated with higher school bullying. And their explanation was that, well, maybe these larger regions or indicators of what's going on in that society can have an impact on what's going on at school. So If there's higher inequality, maybe that reflects higher status competition or competition for resources. Maybe there are more strict social hierarchies, and maybe that is one reason it could be related to higher school bullying among adolescents. So I was trying to kind of think about ways how we can kind of combine this idea, but also look at it with more immediate factors like personality or what's going on at school or at home. So this has led to a kind of a pilot study that we recently did here, where we collected data from students at the university. And we asked them for a range of self-reports on their retrospective bullying experiences, their current aggression experiences. We asked about their mental health, their personality, and then we also asked for their postal codes from the home in which they grew up in their high school years. And then we matched their home postal codes to Statistics Canada data, which are publicly available, to try to get a better understanding of the region in which they grew up in, and trying to see potentially if these regional indicators are also related to their bullying, retrospective bullying behavior and their personality traits. So we're just starting to really analyze these data. So I wanted to present kind of some preliminary results we've been looking at. And in this study that I'm about to present, we primarily focused on bullying and personality with economic indicators. So we asked about their family income, and then we also had the Stats Canada income inequality as well. And we found three subgroups of young adults. So we found one high bullying group, about 5%, and they actually reflected indicators of higher economic advantage. And then we found two low bullying groups. So the majority of participants reflected low bullying and also had economic advantage. And our smallest group reflected low bullying with economic disadvantage. And I'll kind of break down what we found with each of these indicators. I think first I think these groups kind of make sense because we did use a university sample. So we actually found they were generally from more affluent backgrounds. So for bullying, we found, so this was the self-report retrospective indicators of bullying. We found that the high bullying group was significantly different from the other two groups, as we would expect. But I think things get just more interesting in the next couple of slides. So we asked about so we matched their postal code to regional income inequality, and we actually found that the high bullying group came from regions with average income inequality. So they didn't have high inequality, but they also didn't have low inequality. So it's just about average. And that smallest group was actually the group that came from regions with above average income inequality. And that was the only group that was different. And when we asked about their self-reported family income, we again found that this high bullying group reported higher family income. So really, group one and group three, they're very similar in their economic backgrounds in the sense of they come from families that have higher income, average inequality, but one group seems to be engaging in bullying, one doesn't. And what I thought was really interesting was that the kind of main factor that differentiated them came back to this personality trait of honesty, humility. So that first group, the bullying group, was actually the group that were lowest on this trait, meaning that they reported being more exploitative, more deceitful. So I think putting all of this together, it highlights that it's important to look at the context in which these individuals are living in, interacting with their peers, but also it matters about who these people are too. Like, what are the different characteristics? What are their individual traits? And I think at first when I saw these results, I was kind of like, okay, well, this kind of goes against what's been found with other income inequality studies. But I think in the context of our convenient sample of young adults, it makes sense that young adults in a university setting come from more affluent backgrounds. And I think this highlights that, well, we know bullying occurs in all contexts. Like it occurs within all societies, all regions. So just as much as we compare between places, like in the Elgar study, they compared income inequality between countries of varying levels. It's also interesting to look within these regions and to see, well, within these contexts, what are some factors that might contribute to why some people use bullying and others might not. So really that interaction with individual traits, but also the larger social and environmental context of that region. I'm also curious to learn more about the characteristics of these groups and other social and environmental factors. We found that for the second group, that really small, the 3% who were low on bullying and reported economic disadvantage, we didn't find too many other demographic factors to try to understand who these people might be. But when we were looking at correlations, we actually found that higher income inequality and lower family income were associated with having a minority racial or ethnic background. So I think that that's a larger context that we have to take into consideration about who these people are and in what regions that they are also living in too. So that's kind of what I hope to look at more in the future, and definitely on a larger scale with larger samples of youth that are representative, and then also trying to see if we do look within regions that maybe have higher inequality, would we find the same pattern or would we find the opposite pattern? And I think I'm excited to hopefully be able to look at this in the future. So as I kind of mentioned, the takeaway really is that all of these factors matter. It's bullying's complex. And I really hope that if we can identify some of these factors that contribute to bullying, we can try to target them in anti-bullying efforts, and then hopefully reduce opportunities for people to even be able to use bullying behavior. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the implications for this. For bullying prevention. And I wanted to use an example for how this could potentially happen. So in 2021, Tracy was the first to publish this population-based study showing that during the pandemic in Ontario, Canada, we saw the largest drop in bullying prevalence rates that we have ever seen in Ontario, Canada. And then last year with Tracy, Heather, Amanda, we did a follow-up where we were trying to see, well, if the prevalence of bullying has dropped, then do we also see a drop in mental health difficulties that youth experienced from being victimized as well? And I'm sure many of you have seen a lot of pandemic studies, and it's kind of like, you know, we hear like the pandemic's like a natural experiment, but another way that I thought of the pandemic is that it's kind of an event in that largest social ecological system, that chronosystem of changes happening in time at a societal level, because virtually everyone was impacted by the pandemic. So if we can see that that broadest level is impacting bullying, like what are some things we can take away from that for bullying prevention? So I wanted to present what we found in that study with mental health that came out earlier last year. So in this study, as the larger context from the Safe School study, students either answered about their bullying and mental health before the pandemic or bullying and mental health during the pandemic in the fall of 2020. And that was the time period, at least in Ontario, where it was the first time students went back to school in person. And so they weren't online anymore, but obviously the classrooms looked a little bit different. Like there's more teacher supervision. And that was one of the explanations in Tracy's 2021 study, saying that maybe those were some of the factors that contributed to the reduced rates of bullying during that period. So in this study, of course, as we expected, the mean levels of bullying victimization were significantly lower during the fall of 2020 than before the pandemic. And we also found that mental health difficulties as a result of being victimized, so difficulties they attribute to bullying, also significantly dropped at this period compared to before the pandemic. So we were curious to see, well, what about their associations? So we know victimization can be related to mental health difficulties. Are they less strongly associated during the pandemic? And this was a consistent pattern that we found. Overall, that correlation or association between victimization and mental health difficulties were significantly lower during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. They were still significant, as you would imagine, just weaker compared to before the pandemic, but they were still pretty high. And we found this pattern across the overall sample, and it was pretty consistent. We found it for girls, for secondary students. We found it by different forms as well, like physical, social. And I think the big takeaway here is that if we think about all of these systems, these social ecological systems as being interconnected, then maybe just as much as we spend attention on the more microsystem factors, like what's happening at school, it might be just as important to consider what's happening, how that is situated in the larger context. So at that chronosystem level, this pandemic that everyone is experiencing made big changes in that microsystem, in what's happening at schools, what's happening at homes. So if we can consider these, the interconnectedness of these systems, and we know that there are certain factors that are contributing to bullying, such as maybe it is important to have more teacher supervision and making sure that teacher supervision is done in a really like caring and supportive way, then maybe that's a way that we can target anti-bullying efforts. And then at the same time, we know if we reduce bullying, then hopefully we can also reduce any sort of adverse mental health or any other health outcomes that are related to it as well. So in terms of the broader implications, I think the more we understand the different levels of factors that contribute to bullying, it can help us reduce it, and maybe reducing bullying perpetration. So why people are even engaging in this behavior could then trickle down and also reduce mental health difficulties. And perhaps it really is on important to focus on building these meaningful relationships, creating a sense of belonging, but at multiple levels. So definitely at school, definitely at home, and those micro levels, but also I think on a larger societal level of like what we're saying that we tolerate in society, whether directly or indirectly, what we see with competition in society. So I think that building these relationships, it really occurs at multiple levels, and they have interactive and indirect associations with one another. So in terms of what I hope to look at next, as I kind of mentioned already, hopefully continuing to look more at how these individual factors interact with social and environmental factors, ranging from these micro levels to regional, and hopefully in larger representative samples as well of youth, and trying to see if the relevance of these factors or how these factors contribute to bullying also change across development. So what happens in their earlier experiences during earlier childhood, is that going to also impact what happens later during adolescence, or is this more of like an ongoing type of developmental pattern that we see? And finally, I just wanted to acknowledge some great collaborators that I've been working with in Ottawa: Tracy, Amanda, Heather, my Brock colleagues as well in the Brock Research on Aggression and Victimization Experiences Research Group, the various funders who have contributed to all of these studies at every step of the way, and ISRA for having me here, and then some great students that I've been having the opportunity to work with at Brock, and that is it.